Hello, everyone. So I'm not sure if you're saying hello or help or maybe a combination of both, Hassan. I certainly understand that. All right. So, are there questions? Anything that you guys want me to answer before we get started on today's topics? So, I would have, if it was something that I took off, there's going to be comments in the box on WebCat. Um, So there is a big, well, I don't have a picture of the box, but there's a big box in the front section of WebCat. So if it's something that I deducted points from, I'm going to put that in that comment section right there in the front. If it's points that WebCat, I mean, WebCat tells you right there, then and there, that they're taking points off, right? So you can actually, when you come into WebCat and you do your submission, there's going to be an area where you're actually going to see the names of your files. So your files will be listed here, and then there's actually 3 columns as opposed to the 2 columns that you see here, but there's going to be 3 columns in this right here. And the third column is the auto grade points. And you want to see all zeros there. If you see any negative numbers there, then WebCat's subtracting something based upon style. So there's something, maybe something in the Java docs weren't completed. Maybe you have a long line longer than 80 characters. Maybe your indentations are off. Things that don't impact syntax, but that are poor coding style choices. And so WebCat's going to deduct points for those. And those are really easy to fix. To find out what is going on there, you just click on the name of the file over here, and it's just a single click, and it's going to open up your file, and you just scroll down through, and the items that it's deducting points on are going to be highlighted in red, just like this. And you basically just read it. So it's the line itself is highlighted in red, and then right below it is the error message. And you just read that message and find out what's going on. And so I saw for a couple people, they forgot to put the author in the initial Java doc. And so WebCat deducted 5 points for not putting your author in there. Other people left the default author of whoever or missed something else, and WebCat took 2 points off for that. Or if your line is greater than 80 characters, WebCat will deduct points for those. So to find out for those autograder points for that particular column there, what's going on, then you just click on the file and read what it says, and then go back, fix it in BlueJ, recompile, resubmit, and you'll see those errors go down. And you can submit as many times as you want to. WebCat it's not a one and done. You can submit 100 times, I don't care, right? Keep submitting until you have achieved the 60 points possible. Okay. There's other places too. Down at the bottom of WebCat is where it's actually evaluating the logic. So that area here evaluates your coding style, you're making sure you formatted the lab correctly and everything. Then down here at the bottom, WebCat actually evaluates your logic to figure out if you're correct or not. So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to run your test cases against your code, and your test cases have to pass. If your test cases don't pass, then you're going to lose major points, or maybe all of your points. When we get further on in the class, if your test cases don't pass, if 100% of your test cases don't pass, you'll get 0 points for the lab. Okay. So it'll first run your test cases against and check to see, and it'll give you a percentage there, and it'll actually tell you which test case you failed on. Like if you expand this plus sign, it'll tell you which test case you failed on, so you'll know which one didn't work. Then you can also look at code coverage, and you can hit the plus sign there. If it's not at 100% code coverage, you can hit the plus sign and there will be some hints. It'll say this didn't match or that didn't match, and you can look at those hints. And then there's an estimate of program coverage, meaning or coverage from your test, and then an estimate of program coverage. Okay, so you want to look at each one of these things because your tests may pass, but if it says estimate of program coverage is not at 100%, you wrote bad test cases, is what it amounts to. Then your test cases were not correct, and your test cases did not identify the logic errors that were in the code. So what you want to do is you want to go back, don't look at the code, go strictly to your test cases, and I'm going to guess it's going to be record score because that's where everybody is. So I'm making an educated guess there that it's record score that's causing your problem, that you're incorrectly calculating it, and you want to correct your test cases and then run it against your code because there are logic errors in that player class. And your test cases, if correctly written, will help you to identify those logic errors and fix them. Okay, and then the last thing, this down here uses all this stuff to come up with a score at the bottom. So you'll want to hit the plus sign on estimate of problem coverage, and it will tell you which methods. It'll only list 3 methods at a time. So if there's more than 3 methods that have a problem, it's just going to list the first 3. You fix those, and then it'll tell you about the remainder of them. But yeah, so that's what you want to do. You want to go to WebCat. Look at the estimate of problem coverage. It'll tell you what's going on. Go back to your test. Your test cases were probably written to match your code as opposed to written, they were probably written based upon what you saw in the code or an incorrect interpretation of what the record score is supposed to do. So I actually went over the record score again in the week 4 Q&A. We walked through exactly what it is and how you'd write a test case for the record score method to make sure that it could correctly pick up the errors. So I would recommend that you view that recording. And so all the recordings are available in the course. If you go down to the QA or week 4 Q&A, here's the recording right here. And I also did some examples, and those examples are located in this .text file as well. So not sure if that answered. Hopefully it helped to point you in the right direction. You need to, I need to have both the Java and the class files. Or do I need, wait, let me look at that again. The Java files. The README and the .java files. So you'll need the player.java and the player test.java and the readme.txt file. Now you do need to zip them if you're. You may have turned in way too much. If it deducts any style points from the non-critical, those other than those 2, I'll credit those back. So if you turn in too much, it's not going to cause a problem. It doesn't cause things to fail. Every once in a while, it'll deduct a point for poor styling or whatever. But when I see that points are deducted for those things, I just credit those back for you. Yep. But yeah, the minimum, if you wanted to turn in just the bare minimum, it's going to be the .java files and then the readme.txt. Okay. Any other questions about WebCat? So I just want to be kind of clear. If WebCat says that you've earned 8.5 points out of 70 points, I'm going to give you 8.5 points because that's what you've earned. All right. There is no, like I've had conversations with my course manager. There's no, what WebCat says is what you get. Now, I mean, I get to allocate the remaining 10 points, so I have a little bit of leeway with those 10 points, but those aren't an automatic. I'm going to take a look at your code and read through your code and check your readme.txt file and all of those things and allocate those 10 points based upon what I see. But if WebCat says you've earned 8.5 points, then you've earned 8.5 points. So you don't want to just submit to WebCat and move on and assume life is good, my assignment's there, You want to actually look at the feedback you're getting from WebCat and make sure that you're maximizing and trying to get as close to 60 points as you possibly can. Okay? All right. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move through this. If you guys come up with other questions or if you have other questions about WebCat, we can always talk at the end as well, or if questions come up here, don't hesitate to ask, all right? We have a lot of slides today, so we'll see the other thing I wanted to say, and I know we're already like 15 minutes in, so I'm going to be Speedy Gonzalez tonight to try to get through all these slides, but week 4, we are Thursday of week 4, right? Which means we are halfway through week 4. Next week is week 5, and week 6 is the midterm. So you are a week and a half away from the midterm. Programming midterms are challenging, and I don't want to say challenging, I want to say programming midterms are brutal, okay? Brutal is an appropriate word for a programming midterm. All programming midterms fall into that category, especially when you're in the intro classes and you're not used to them. As you get in the upper level classes, I think you're used to the challenge of the midterm, and so you're more prepared. But they are brutal, so you want to prepare. Owen, same difficulty level as a COMP-111 midterm is what I would say. So hard, right? So you want to make sure you prepare. And so what I have out here for you is if you go to the course website, week 6, you're going to find the midterm icon right here, right? You're going to click on that midterm icon, and down here I have a little video that I've recorded, and I have a study guide. You want to work through this study guide, okay? And I would say if you are struggling with any of the concepts in this class, schedule a tutoring session for next week right now. Complete this study guide prior to your tutoring session and take the study guide with you to the tutoring session and walk through the areas that you're finding challenging, okay? Because the midterm is going to push your limits, right? It's going to be very, very challenging or hard for you, okay? So you want to make sure you're as prepared as possible, and starting now is not too early. The other thing with the study guide is if you complete it and send it to me, I'll definitely let you know what's correct and what's not correct. So I'll give you an evaluation. You do need to give me a couple days, like don't give it to me today if you're planning on taking the exam tomorrow kind of a thing. But anyway, I just wanted to put that out there to get you start thinking about the midterm now so that you're prepared when it comes in week 6. Okay, so on to the PowerPoint. All right, variables, strings. We're going to do some fun stuff today, so you guys are going to like this. So we're going to talk about implicit, this is not the fun stuff, implicit and explicit parameters. We're going to go over those again, variables, instance variables, local, and parameters, kind of define all those terms, define the terms static and final. We're going to talk about operators, which would be multiplication, division, those sorts of things, string objects, and then there's the fun part, the scanner class. So we're going to actually get into the point where you can prompt users to enter input onto the console and receive input from them. So we're going to have a little interaction going on here. Okay, so implicit versus explicit parameters. We've been talking about explicit parameters in our method calls, right? When you call a method, there's those parentheses at the end, and your explicit parameters are defined inside of those parentheses. And you think of them as explicit because you can explicitly see them, right? They are right there in front of your face. You can see them when you call the method, you're passing them. You can see them when you define the method because you're defining them, so they're explicit. Implicit parameters, on the other hand, are implied. So you're seeing them, but you tend to overlook them and not think of them. So the implicit parameter is going to be the object that is calling the method. So that object is implied. That particular object is implied when you're referencing things inside of the class code, your blueprint, right? So explicit parameters, you're explicitly seeing them and specifying them. The implicit parameter is the object that calls the method, and it's more implied. You're not physically looking at it, and that's when we use the keyword this inside of our class. We're using the keyword this, and that really refers to this object that just called me. That's the one I'm talking about, the implied parameter. Okay, so when a method is called, there is always an implicit parameter. This is the object that's calling the method. So remember, the format for calling a method is object name dot method name, and then we have these open and closing parentheses. So this object name, or whatever is the name of your object that's calling the method, is your implicit parameter. Explicit parameters, of course, are the things that are inside of the parentheses, and there can be 0 to many explicit parameters. So there's always one implicit parameter, just one, never 0, never anything else, one. But explicit, there could be 0 to many. And it all just depends upon what's inside the parentheses. So if we look at this, what is my implicit parameter? Or I'm sorry, my implicit parameter. Yes, it's going to be temp student. And what is my explicit parameter? There are none because those parentheses are empty. So you're always going to zero in when you're trying to determine between implicit and explicit. Zero in on that period, and everything prior to the period is going to be your object, and what's after the period with those parentheses is going to be your method. Okay? All right, so we've got pet1.setName Duke. So what's my implicit parameter? Yep, pet1. And what's my explicit parameter? Yeah, that string value of Duke. It's what's inside of the parentheses. Okay. So those are implicit and explicit, and when you're looking inside of the class, when you're defining that data type, whenever you see the keyword this, it's referring to the implicit parameter. Okay? Now, local variables, these are declared within the body of a method. So we have instance variables that are defined within the class, right? And those are available to all the methods within the class. But then we also have local variables, and these are declared within the actual body of the method. Local variables have to be initialized to a value before they can be used. Instance variables will default to a value depending upon their data type. So numeric instance variables will default to zeros. String instance variables default to a null or a none type. But local variables, they will be undefined. So if you try to access them, you're going to get an error. The scope of a local variable, which means when does it live? It comes into existence in the method at the point it's declared and ceases to exist when the method ends. So as soon as the method is finished executing all of its statements, that local variable ceases to exist. So it's only available within the method that it's been declared. It's not, so no other methods are going to know about that local variable. All right. Parameter variables, on the other hand, those are your explicit parameters that are defined within those parentheses. So those are declared within the header of a method. Okay, so on that public statement of the method, they are contained within the parentheses. They're passed as arguments when you're calling that method, and their scope is the same. They're actually considered a local variable. Their scope comes into existence at the point it's declared within that method header, and they cease to exist when the method ends. They're only available within the method in which they were defined in the header statement. Other methods do not have access to those particular variables. All right, so here we have a class. So we have public class pet store, and these are two instance variables. They're defined as private because we want to encapsulate them, right? The hiding of implementation details. So we're encapsulating them by defining them as private. One is store name and one is store number. So these would be available or accessible by all the methods inside of this class. So their instance variables, their scope is the entire class. So every method in the class would have access, and we would refer to these as this dot store name, this dot store number, and this keyword tells you this is the implicit object that called this particular method, kind of a thing. Okay. These, on the other hand, string in name, integer in num, these are your explicit parameters or your explicit parameter or a parameter, right? So they are defined right here at the public pet store level. They exist within this constructor only. This is a constructor because there's no return data type. So they exist within this constructor. They come into existence here, and they cease to exist when this constructor finishes. So up here, they're not going to know about in name and in num, and down here, they're not going to know about it. They only exist within this particular constructor, or if it's a method in this method. Okay. Here we have, again, instance variables, and here we have a non-constructor, just a regular method. Data types, it returns data type string, display store info, no explicit parameters because the parentheses are empty, but we are declaring a local variable right here, output. Okay, and so this local variable output comes into existence right here on line 5. It continues to exist for this whole method and ceases to exist when we hit the closing bracket for this particular method, so in line 7. So up here, they don't know about the variable output, and down here, they don't know about the variable output. Only inside this method, this display store info, do they know about the variable output. So it's local to this method only, comes into existence when it's defined, and ceases to exist when we hit the closing curly bracket for the method. All right, so those are implicit parameters, explicit parameters, instance variables, local variables. So you're saying the program that called the method would receive the output. Yes, so in this particular case, wherever we're at, whatever program created the object and then called this method, they would receive the output from calling this. So they would get this output that would be built. Yep, absolutely. All right, so do we have questions on local variables versus parameters, implicit versus explicit? Oh, excellent. Well, your instance variables are global, right, for an object. Your instance variable exists for the entire program. If you're writing an actual program and not a class like we've been doing, then yes, you can define variables that exist for the whole entire program. Not in what we're going to be doing. So no, we're not going to have a global constant in a package, which would be what you're talking about. If we're having a bunch of different programs or a bunch of different classes, that would be part of a package. you're not going to define your instance variables as public, but you could define other things as public. So for instance, we could define, if we have a constant that we're using, we could define that as public, because a constant is a value that's never going to change. So there's not going to be a set and a get method for a constant because it's constant, right? So those could be public that anybody could access. And so the important thing is if you have a value in your program that you know isn't going to change. So for example, the value of a quarter. A quarter is always 25 cents, right? It's never 50 cents. It's never a dollar. It's always 25 cents. So it's a value that's not going to change. change.